Well, then, welcome back to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. My name is Eric Young. Joining me today is Elyse Hauser, freelance journalist and publisher of the Notes from the Deep newsletter. And so what we're going to do today is a news roundup episode. There's been a lot happening lately in deep sea mining, and I wanted to get Elyse on to just kind of give us a rundown of kind of the major headlines, which excuses me from having to cover things and be newsworthy. So Elyse, thanks for being here.
Yeah, happy to be here. Round up the news like cattle.
Yeah, and this will be this is published on the Elements of Deep Sea Mining channels and also available on Elyse's Notes from the Deep Substack. So if you are watching this on one of those two platforms, then consider subscribing also to the other. Mm-hmm. I guess, I don't know. Elyse, how's it going?
It's going good. I feel like you and I were like, let's do a news roundup. And then it was suddenly the busiest month in deep sea mining news maybe ever, so it's been really interesting. There's been a lot of news to follow, and I followed all the deep sea mining news for a long time, and only just in the past month and a half or so have I found it actually hard to keep up with all the headlines. And I'm still keeping up with all the big news items, but maybe not reading every single article in every single outlet of all sizes, because all of a sudden there's too many, and I can't recall that ever happening before.
Yeah. And I mean, the audience of this podcast is generally already familiar with deep sea mining. So, I mean, I assume some of these, especially big headline news items, everyone is pretty familiar with. But I guess let's start there with the big headline news items and work our way through to some of the things that people like me who don't follow all of the news are unaware of.
Totally. Yeah, so the biggest news has been out of North America, where the U.S. is suddenly diving into deep sea mining after kind of lingering on the diving board for a very long time. And two companies, one headquartered in Canada and one headquartered in the U.S., are working toward that kind of U.S. partnership, going through U.S. laws to, as they hope, mine the deep sea in the next few years.
Yeah, and so, right, so this is obviously the big headline that broke during when the ISA was just wrapping up its session back in April.
I think it was March. I want to say it was the end of March.
So we've had this news for a while.
Yeah. So it was the metals company, which is headquartered in Canada, that announced on, I believe, the last day of the International Seabed Authority meeting in March, that it would be working with the U.S. to mine the deep sea, basically circumventing International Seabed Authority, or ISA, approval, which is kind of a brand new thing. So I'll explain a little bit about the ISA. It's kind of a group, I think it's 169 countries plus the EU, so 170 member states that come together to decide what to do in the ocean where it's beyond national jurisdiction, so no one technically owns it. But the US never agreed to that kind of rule-making scheme back in the 20th century. The US decided to just stay out of it and ended up making its own law, which is called the I always forget it. I think it's Deep Seabed Resources Hard Minerals Act, something like that. But anyway, the U.S. has its own law that was meant to be kind of a temporary law to let U.S. companies start exploring deep sea mining until the international rules were in place. And then when the U.S. decided not to join the ISA and be part of that international group, it just kind of kept its own laws around. So basically, the metals company, this Canadian brand, said, oh, we're going to go through this US law and go mine the high seas through the US because the ISA is taking too long to make regulations.
It's worth stressing that this Deep Seabed Hard Minerals Resource Act, I just lost it also.
Deep Seabed Hard Mineral Resources Act.
Yeah.
Hard Mineral Resource Act.
DSHMRA.
Yes. I hear people call it DSHMRA, so if you'd like.
Probably one of those things that no one has ever had to like pronounce as an acronym until recently, and so
yeah.
But so this has been on the books in the United States since the 70s or the 80s or something. It's been on the books.
80, I believe it was 1980 when it first came on.
Do you think that like so this was the US? I mean, this is around the time when the ISA was becoming a thing. So was this like a response in the US to like they declined joining the ISA and then they made their own regulations that kind of would do the same thing because suddenly there was like a purpose to having some sort of framework around mining in the deep sea. And so this was like maybe the US's specific response to that.
Yeah, kind of, but in a slightly different order. So basically, as the ISA was sort of being planned, the US decided to go ahead and make its own law so that companies that wanted to explore, test equipment, whatever, didn't have to wait. And then the idea was that the US would join the ISA and that kind of interim law would become obsolete. So it's sort of meant as a temporary thing that actually came before. But then the US decided not to join the ISA because Ronald Reagan, who was the president at the time, was like, this is not the best for US business interests. He felt that things like benefit sharing with smaller countries and things like that were just not what the US would want to do, and so kept the US out, and the US has stayed out ever since, and so never actually got rid of what was originally meant as a temporary law. Now that law is still around. And there's been some speculation on whether the areas they're applying to mine through US law are the same areas as the ones they've been exploring through the ISA, but the company, as far as I've seen, has not confirmed that yet.
Yeah, I imagine from their perspective, it would be really nice if it was the same because they've done so much exploration and environmental studies on their areas that to have to switch areas is going to set them back a lot of environmental work at the very least.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so that's the metals company applying through DSHMRA. Metals company applying through DSHMRA. Yeah. And then kind of around the same time, to the point that it's getting blended together, is Impossible Metals also applying through the U.S. government. So what's happening there?
Yeah. So Impossible Metals, which is a US-based company, is applying for permits to mine in the US seabed, the US exclusive economic zone. And so it's a much simpler kind of regulatory situation. So there's two separate US agencies. One has jurisdiction over the kind of international permitting. One has jurisdiction over the permitting for deep sea mining in US waters. And, you know, countries can do mostly whatever they want in their exclusive economic zones, including deep sea mining. So there's no real controversy over, you know, whether or not this is allowed. So it's a different agency, it's a different permitting process. I saw that the agency, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, is committed now to reviewing that application. And so there will be some next steps, including a public kind of stakeholder input process. I think that's one of the next steps for that. So there's, two companies applying to mine through the US, but in very different ways.
And okay. So I guess that's important to emphasize because I feel like that's prone to getting missed in at least kind of the superficial headline reading public, is that two different companies, two different applications for two different areas, one international and one domestic waters, although it's off American Samoa,
Mm-hmm.
and then through two different agencies, NOAA versus BOEM.
Yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of news items kind of conflate or muddy the waters, or even some of the big news outlets claimed that both companies were applying for the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration permits, which actually NOAA only permits the international side of things through the US. So just kind of missing a whole other agency that's involved is something that I've seen a lot of, which maybe doesn't mean that much for public understanding of the issue, but it's fairly important to note that there's separate, regulations and organizations in charge.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's super important. It's a super important distinction, I think. And so, yeah, the two articles that you've put up here that we'll put links to, one is the New York Times, one is AP. Basically, yeah, saying that NOAA is being directed by the U.S. government to fast track permits for companies to mine the ocean floor in both U.S. and international waters. So, yeah, I think that's kind of one of the most basic distinctions here that people need to be aware of the distinction in.
Yeah, and it's in the executive order, so I'm a little bit not sure how it got missed, especially by major news outlets that presumably have multiple pairs of eyes on an article before it goes public. But yeah,
right. But just another reason why everyone should follow your newsletter, where they'll get the news put in context of someone who's knowledgeable and has been following this for long enough to get the distinctions. So yeah, and then I mean, I guess the reason that distinction is important is that on the one hand, there's kind of a pretty big difference, I think, between the U.S. granting rights to apply in international waters. That's received a lot of pushback. China has kind of come out and said this is a very dangerous move, whereas the U.S. Issuing permits to do things in the U.S. Extended Economic Zone, which is, I'll just finish my thought, is much less controversial. I don't think anybody is kind of saying the U.S. is overstepping by considering impossible metals application through BOEM. One thing that's interesting, I guess, just from the Norwegian perspective where I sit, is there's been so much controversy over Norway developing these regulations over the past 2-3 years, both domestically here in Norway and kind of internationally. We hear about pushback from the EU and people kind of criticizing Norway for doing this process. And then, I mean, this is the first that I learned that the US has had essentially the same laws on the books forever. So I kind of thought Norway was breaking new ground here by making such regulations. And then I learned that they're decades behind the US, really.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it's controversial because Norway was both kind of making the regulations and planning to use them, whereas for a long time the US just kind of had these regulations sitting there and was doing a lot of background work, what I would call honestly prep work for deep sea mining, quantifying minerals in US waters and kind of hammering out, what sort of environmental regulations might look like. Like, I've been following this for a while, and so I think there's a lot of lead up there to deep sea mining, but it was sort of non-controversial, unless you looked at it really closely. It didn't seem like much was happening. And now all of a sudden it's all happening. But yeah, I mean, all of the headlines, that are in a lot of major outlets are saying things like, oh, Trump is making deep sea mining happen in the US, but it's a little bit misleading because Trump is fast tracking an existing process and would not be able to take that dive if the US had not already been on the diving board.
Yeah. And so, okay, so then that's kind of the next newsworthy piece in this the next puzzle piece in this news story is the Trump executive order. Can you
Mhm.
explain what the substance of that really is?
Yeah. So there are a lot of moving parts there, but basically the executive order is fast tracking US deep sea mining, both in terms of the NOAA permits for international areas and in terms of the BOEM permits for US waters. And
And
there's,
by
yeah,
fast tracking, it's just kind of Trump telling the regulators in these organizations, get this to the top of your priority list. Try to do this faster. There's
yeah, yeah,
no, he hasn't
basically,
said get this done by a certain day or anything. It's kind of just a statement of intent.
yeah, to kind of speed up the permitting process, as I understand it, the process of evaluating and maybe issuing permits and all of that. And there are also things in it about kind of where these minerals might end up. There's a call for making a national defense stockpile or adding deep sea mined minerals to the national defense stockpile. So that would make the U.S. government, the U.S. military, a buyer of these seabed minerals. So again, there's no like this is definitely going to happen, but it's a call to kind of explore these possibilities.
No, right on. Yeah, and then the thing that I think of when uh, Trump puts his kind of executive stamp on this story is how like the potential for bleed over from the polarization of just American politics and the Trump phenomenon into the deep sea mining space, which is already, notoriously polarized.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I kind of assume that the camps were kind of naturally prone to lining up in certain ways. That liberals who are anti-Trump are probably also more likely to be anti-deep sea mining,
Mm-hmm.
but that this is really going to entrench differences. So one thing that you told me the last time we spoke about this, which I think is really important, is that like this isn't new. This didn't happen because of Trump. At least not the impossible metals. Like this isn't the first time that they've applied to
Mm-hmm.
these processes. Is that right?
Yeah, they applied also last year. So, when the Biden administration was still in power, and that application, which was also to, mine around American Samoa, did not move forward. But my understanding is that it wasn't really a hard no. I actually talked to a representative from BOEM at the time because I was, exploring that as a story. And they were like, yeah, we decided to kind of hold off on moving it forward and do some more consultation with the government of American Samoa. But they weren't like, oh, this is not going to happen. They were like, it's not going to happen right now.
Mm.
Uh, and, the Biden administration, there was a call for like a deep sea mining moratorium in the US, and they definitely did not sign on to that. So although they weren't really pushing the industry forward, they also were not holding it back. And a lot of the kind of US government funded exploration and quantification of deep sea minerals was happening under that and prior administrations. So again, it's this kind of groundwork.
Yeah. So it's important. I think it's important not uh, to kind of paint this process with the kind of Trump colors. This is
Mm-hmm.
something that is long-standing United States policy, and Impossible Metals has been working at it gradually, and it happened now, and Trump is fast tracking it, but it's not exactly. It doesn't fall into the Trump phenomenon. What about the government of American Samoa? What effects have they had on this?
Yeah. So it's interesting because actually American Samoa instituted a moratorium on deep sea mining in its waters, and I believe that came shortly after the first Impossible Metals application. But now American Samoa has a new governor. And so my understanding is that this new governor might be more open to deep sea mining. And of course, a moratorium, unless it has a hard date, like this moratorium lasts for X number of years, really can be lifted at any time. It's just kind of
Mm.
this symbolic thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. So yeah. So um, interesting again too. And I'm going to try to get someone from American Samoa, because they are one of the louder voices coming from the Pacific region. So I'm going to try to get someone on to kind of explain their situation. But it's interesting also that there's like an interaction between two different kind of governments on this. There's American Samoa has its own government, and then there's the U.S. government, which has made the regulations which are going to allow mining in American Samoa.
Yeah, I mean, even in one country in one country's, territorial waters, it's so complicated.
Yeah. What else is worth mentioning on this topic, and on, I don't know, I guess on the coverage that you're seeing of it?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of news coverage, I do see a lot of articles about deep sea mining still saying that the US wants these metals for the energy transition, electric cars, and things like that, and only saying that. And that demand certainly exists. I mean, we know that the Trump administration is allied with, Elon Musk and his Cybertruck, so it's not like there's no interest in building EVs, electric vehicles, but it's a big kind of missed point when articles don't also mention that there's a military and national security use for these minerals, and that's a really strong source of the desire from the Trump administration, and this kind of national defense stockpile that might end up buying the minerals would be using them for, defense purposes, could be building jet engines, military munitions, all these kinds of things. So just kind of stating that the energy transition is the demand for deep sea metals in the US isn't really true. There's way more to it than that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, this is similar in the critical minerals conversation. I guess the critical minerals conversation is the conversations that I'm kind of following is a little bit more advanced. It has gone through this transition recently, where it was originally, or 5 years ago when I kind of got into it, it was all electric vehicle batteries, wind turbine, permanent magnets all the time. And then lately there's been a lot more discussion of the military applications. And I think just this comes from the geopolitical developments that are happening. There's a lot more tension in the world. There's a lot more, like originally it was, we're trying to beat, China, they are winning the energy transition game. And now there's a lot more fear that, oh, what if China turns off the spigot of these things that we not only need to, adjust our car seats front and back, but also super important for defense applications that we're very dependent on.
Yeah, and it's a big question because, China is still controlling the processing side of things. So if the US is stockpiling these minerals from the deep sea, where would they go to be turned into something usable? Is the US going to bring its own processing facilities online? Is it going to look for other countries that can do that? That's kind of a big open question now as well.
You are speaking my language. This is something that this is the difference between having a mineral and being able to process that mineral to a finished product is something that is a particular hobby horse of mine, and I just try to bring that up in every context that it's relevant, because it's easy to miss how hard it is to get a nodule to be the precursor that's needed for an electric vehicle battery. What else on this, if we can stay in the US for another minute? What else are you covering here?
Yeah, I mean, a slightly more nebulous kind of criticism I have of some of the news coverage is just the claims that permitting deep sea mining is totally against the intended purpose of US agencies, NOAA and BOEM, which I don't think it is. I mean, NOAA is part of the Department of Commerce. BOEM's stated mission, if you go to their website, is all about resource development. And I don't think it makes sense to say, oh, US agencies are only intended to do kind of basic science and not to do resource stuff. I mean, the US is too heavily focused on resource and business and profit and everything, to make a claim like that, in my mind. But it's a little bit, you can't really quantify that with hard evidence, but you can go to the agency websites and see what they say.
Yeah. Noted. Yeah. And so then I guess next on your list here is the U.S. Congressional Subcommittee hearing.
Yeah.
It's called Exploring the Potential of Deep Sea Mining to Expand American Mineral Production by the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I watched it, and it was, a lot of it was not terribly exciting, but kind of an interesting window into, what the conversations with the U.S. government can look like on this topic. So the metals company was there, Impossible Metals was there. Everyone brought a nodule and showed it off, which I always find kind of entertaining.
Yeah.
Even the person running it, Congressman Paul Gosar, brought his own nodule, and it was like a land nodule instead of a sea nodule. But it was like, wow, everyone has one. But Gosar, the man in charge, also was quite hard to follow. So he was perhaps the most interesting thing about it, because he went on a lot of tangents and wasn't always, to me, making a whole lot of sense. So that kept things a little bit strange.
Yeah. You put me onto this. I've watched a little bit of it now since the last time we talked, and it is kind of newsworthy in its bizarreness. And
yeah,
it's worth.
No news items mentioning it. There were news items about the hearing, but none of them said, yeah, the person leading it was super weird and hard to follow.
Yeah, and kind of went off on tangents, and it was interesting to see everyone kind of reacting and trying to follow his line of logic. So that's worth checking out for entertainment value, in addition to kind of seeing a little bit of how the sausage gets made.
Yeah, it's worth watching at least part of it, I would say.
Now I've lost our list here. What's the next news item?
Yeah, well, I think the rest that we can say about the US stuff right now is kind of forward-looking and speculative. So there's been a lot of talk out there about how different laws may or may not apply. Andrew Thaler at Southern Fried Science, which is a science blog by scientists, brought up the Jones Act, which is part of the Merchant Marine Act. And that stipulates that ships moving goods from U.S. port to U.S. port have to be built, owned, and operated by U.S. citizens. So things like that could potentially affect deep sea mining companies who are, say, using a ship that was built elsewhere. But it is also hard to say. I mean, there are often exceptions and workarounds to different laws. So it's just kind of people talking through what could apply here. This is such new regulatory territory.
Yeah. And I've seen reaction from some of TMC's people to that Andrew Thaler piece, and kind of saying, well, these aren't very big hurdles. If they apply at all, they won't be showstoppers. So yeah, it's definitely, I mean, it's so new, and everyone is speculating.
Yeah, and the speculation's interesting, even though there aren't hard answers. I've seen things like the idea that global markets could be rejecting metals as illegally sourced if the U.S. is acting unilaterally on the high seas. And
yeah, it would be great if metals markets managed to find a way to identify and I mean, just aside from deep sea mining, I feel like that claim is optimistic. There's, aside from diamonds and a couple other small markets, metals industry is notoriously difficult to identify the source, even if you wanted to avoid. So, but it's a problem that everyone is trying to address. So maybe we'll get there.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe the biggest kind of forward-looking question is, how effective will the U.S. government be at expediting this process? Because there have been so many big staff cuts in the U.S. And so I'm kind of curious how that is going to play out.
Yeah, because not only does this require a lot of paperwork, but this isn't exactly a regulation that has been used before. So there's going to be a lot of work to figure out how to make it work. Not sure to what extent it was designed for this kind of case. And so, it's worth mentioning that the finish line is potentially still a ways away.
Yeah, it is uncharted waters. So I think the next steps to kind of pay attention to, at least for people listening to this who are in the U.S., are the public input, public consultation steps, which both BOEM and NOAA will have coming up probably fairly soon. So that should be interesting.
Great. Yeah, good to know. Maybe we should try to put links to that, because that's something that people can actively kind of get involved in.
Yeah. I don't know if links are available yet, but I'll look around, and if not, then when they are, we can share them.
Right on. Okay, then let's move away from the US and come to my adopted country, and you can tell us about the latest news out of Norway.
Yeah. I mean, there hasn't really been much since Norway's exploration program was put on hold. But I suppose the biggest news was that Loke Marine Minerals went bankrupt. So that's one of the small handful of Norwegian deep sea mining companies, and they were exploring mining in Norwegian waters as well as internationally through the ISA. And then they announced their bankruptcy, I think, in April, and it really didn't get much press. I guess a company going bankrupt is not a huge news item. There's not much to say about it, and the company probably doesn't want to talk to the media about it. But companies have kind of gone bankrupt in the deep sea mining space before and reemerged, maybe with a different name or slightly reformulated, but it certainly is possible that we will see another version of Loke come back sometime.
Yeah, especially since, as you pointed out, I think in the Financial Times piece that you shared, so Loke had contracts or they had licenses to mining sites in the CCZ, and then when they went bankrupt, the question is who's going to get those, and there's going to be an auction process. And Financial Times reported that some of the investors and owners and main actors in Loke were themselves trying to buy the the company that held these licenses. So that's an indication that they are this is maybe just a temporary knockdown for those particular people, and that it'll reemerge.
Yeah, I mean, deep sea miners are really not known for giving up. They're quite tenacious in my experience.
Yeah, I guess there's something about the long shot nature of this that it's going to attract those kind of people.
Mm-hmm.
You also pointed out that Greenpeace made a bid for one of Loke CCZ exploration licenses.
Yeah, I think, it was something of a publicity stunt, but it didn't get much publicity, and I don't think they got them, but kind of interesting.
Yeah, and we don't know. I don't know if you know who got those, what happened with those, what the outcome of that has been.
I haven't seen an update on it yet. I mean, it's through the UK, so being in the US, I'm not getting maybe the most up-to-date or most detailed news out of the UK, but definitely keeping an eye out to see where those might land.
Okay, then on to Kiribati, or as I've heard you pronounce it, Kiribati.
Yeah, my understanding is that in locally, the TI at the end of the word is pronounced as an S. Kiribati.
Great. Okay.
Yes. So Kiribati, which is a Pacific Island nation that used to work with the metals company. The metals company works through subsidiaries in a number of other nations. Although they're based in Canada, that's how they work in the US, and now they work in the Pacific because they opened subsidiaries. But TMC, I guess, dissolved its partnership with Kiribati, just decided that it wasn't worth it. And so now Kiribati is talking with China about partnering on deep sea mining. And China has also partnered with the islands on deep sea mining. And so those partnerships appear to be things like sharing expertise. China can offer maybe more advanced technology than these countries otherwise have access to. And maybe it gives China a little bit more power to access certain Pacific minerals. So that's definitely still emerging. But given that the US is now looking at deep sea mining in the Pacific, and China, through other countries, is looking at deep sea mining in the Pacific, it almost feels like we're leaning towards some sort of face-off, which might be interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, from my perspective, China has flown a little bit under the radar in deep sea mining. We don't talk so much about them. We talk a lot about the metals company, Impossible Metals, some of the kind of European companies and the Norwegian companies here anyway. But as you pointed out to me, I think the first time we talked, China has the most concessions in the CCZ. Mm-hmm. And they are definitely one of the leading players in terms of developing mining technology and kind of getting it ready for exploitation. So, I mean, like in everything else, China poses like a big threat of a big kind of come from behind takeover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, what they're doing is interesting. And a Chinese deep sea mining company called Min Metals apparently just got the green light from the ISA to run deep sea mining tests in the Pacific. So I think they're going to trial their collector vehicles, do maybe a pilot, test mine or whatever. And that will probably happen later this year. So that'll be interesting to see what it comes.
Yeah, wow.
Of that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they're advancing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to see more news items on China. And I think there's this kind of idea that, it's just going to be propaganda, and it's hard to get the true story. And they're just trying to, show their military might. But I mean, that's kind of the same as the US on some level. If you talk to the US government, they're going to give you the party line. So, yeah, I think they could use a lot more attention.
Yeah. I feel like it's also it's harder to get information. I mean, when you shared this story about the test mining, I tried to look up that company, and they do have a website. Sorry. But it didn't have much information, It gave me enough to know that they are a big existing mining company. And so whether that's just language barriers or just the fact that they're not, maybe it's that the Chinese companies aren't really trying to appeal to at least the English-speaking world in terms of investment, so they're not putting themselves out there in terms of advertising their progress, or maybe they're not really looking for investment at all because of the way that Chinese government supports industries that it feels are important to its kind of national strategy. So it is it's hard to know what's going on there. Okay, the next on the list, Portugal and New Caledonia moratoriums.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Portugal instituted a moratorium on deep sea mining in its exclusive economic zone until 2050. So I feel like the moratoriums that have endpoints are really the moratoriums that have teeth. It really means something. You can't just get another Portuguese, administration and they can just lift it at any time. So it's going to last for 25 years. And I think for Portugal, it makes a lot of sense because they have a really amazing and large kind of deep sea zone around the Azores, which are the islands, far off the Portuguese coast in the Atlantic. And there's minerals around there, and there's been interest in the past in mining those minerals. So they just kind of made this blanket moratorium until 2050 that none of these zones are, up for consideration. And that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, for me, I feel like the whole time I'm talking here, I'm just exposing how little I actually know about deep sea mining. But for me, this was the first time where I've actually heard of a moratorium with an end date, because I always feel like moratoriums are just kind of a way of saying no deep sea mining until we're ready to deep sea mine, which is kind of the same thing that people who are pro deep sea mining tend to say. No deep sea mining until we have all of the studies in place. And so, so seeing a moratorium with a specific end date that can't just kind of be lifted when whatever criteria are arbitrarily met is nice to see.
Yeah, these seem much more meaningful, and it puts me in mind of the global moratorium on taking resources from Antarctica, which I think was also a 50-year moratorium or until 2050. I forget which one. It ends around 2050, but it was just kind of, it just took Antarctica off the table for this amount of time, and that really, changes things. That has meaning. But yeah, these kind of moratoriums that are a bit of a shrug, like, oh, we'll say no until we decide to say yes, that has less meaning. So it's important to be clear when we talk about moratoriums what kind of moratorium we're talking about.
Yeah. And then so what about New Caledonia? What are they doing?
Yeah, so that's a French territory in the Pacific. They instituted a 50-year moratorium, so that would mean no deep sea mining until 2075 on exploring and mining deep sea minerals in its territory. I'm a bit less familiar with whether there has ever been interest in deep sea mining around New Caledonia. As far as I know, there hasn't, but I could be wrong. Sometimes a moratorium is in an area where it would probably never be mined anyway, but it is just kind of a stance to take. And I don't really know which one that is. I know, like, where I live on the west coast of the US, all of the states have deep sea mining moratoriums, but no one would be deep sea mining there anyway. So it's a bit of a symbolic thing. Yeah, but this one does have a specific end date. So that means something.
Yeah. And I mean, New Caledonia has a very kind of involved history with mining, specifically with nickel mining, where they have, I just looked it up, they have 10% of the world nickel reserves. And
Wow.
and they've had a lot of mining, but because they're French territory, there's been this real colonial relationship where it's a French company that has been doing at least some of that nickel mining there, and there's been a lot of pushback from the locals to the point, I might get this wrong, that they also have made their own kind of indigenous led nickel operation there. Doesn't really connect to deep sea mining, but it's whether or not New Caledonia has deep sea resources, it has a lot of experience with resource curses. So
yeah, and it's important to note that different areas have different relationships with resource extraction that will affect how they feel about deep sea mining.
Okay, then I guess we're moving to science news.
Yeah, a couple of interesting studies have come out recently. So there was one by the UK's National Oceanography Centre and Natural History Museum where they went back to a mining test area 44 years later and saw some biological recovery, not total recovery, but there were still kind of the impacts from the vehicle tracks. You could still see where the mining vehicle had passed through, but some animals had recolonized that area. It wasn't the same number or the same diversity level as there was before the mining test, but some things were coming back. Kind of a neutral outcome.
Yeah, or at least it gets spun different. I mean, it certainly have seen a lot of takes on this from different sides and a lot of disagreement about how to interpret these things.
Yeah, you could focus on the impacts, you could focus on the recovery. And like so many things about deep sea mining, this feels to me kind of like a Rorschach test where you can look at it and see what you want to see, it's just sort of open to interpretation. But what it actually says is pretty neutral. It's just saying there's some recovery, not that much, but some.
Yeah, no, I love that analogy. It reveals more about the person interpreting the study as to how that was to what they focus on. Yeah, and then yeah, the seafloor imaging study.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of those studies that feels kind of obvious, but also important. It found that, in terms of humans actually visually seeing the deep sea, like with a camera, or the rare, people going down into deep sea submersible and seeing it with their own eyes, they have only seen 99.999% of the deep seabed. So that means, 0.001%, to put it differently, has been visually imaged by humans, which, yeah, duh, we're not down there a lot. But it's still interesting to put a number on it. And the study had some maps that kind of showed, the hot spots around the US, Japan, New Zealand. It's kind of these main countries that are exploring the deep sea. And so we really have vast areas that have just never been looked at, and who knows what's there. There could be new types of ecosystems that we just haven't happened to stumble across yet.
Yeah, no, that's it's actually really good context and interesting to kind of think about. Okay, if we've seen so little, like what are we focusing on? I've heard people say that in the context of like C4 massive sulfides, which is where the kind of extinct vents are. Mm-hmm. We really kind of, everyone wants to study what's going on at the active vents because that's interesting and there's a lot more going on there. And so there's been a lot of research done kind of where we're not going to mine, where there's no interest in mining. Mm-hmm. And the more relevant to deep sea mining areas are left out of the picture.
Yeah, they've been considered more scientifically boring. So, and I think, yeah, we've looked at a lot of canyons in the deep sea, but maybe not quite so many seamounts. So it's just kind of both scientific interest and then kind of industry money, are dictating where we look at in the deep sea. There's, it's not likely that we're just kind of going out there randomly just for fun. It would be cool.
Yeah. And I mean, it also emphasizes just how new the technology is that takes us here. I mean, the reason that deep sea mining is, I mean, yeah, obviously it has been a thing. There was test mining done 44 years ago, mm-hmm. but really it has a lot to do with kind of recent technological developments. This is the first time that we have had real access. We're only just developing the ability to access these places.
Yeah. I mean, I think we didn't discover hydrothermal vents until 1977. It's quite recent.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that really ties into a lot of the narratives and a lot of people's reaction to this is we've just gotten access to a place and then we are kind of looking at it through the mineral exploitation lens and that mm-hmm. triggers frankly valid concerns.
Yeah. I think the often cited idea is that we know more about the moon than about the deep sea, which is kind of true and not true. We think it's that we have better maps of the moon than we have of the deep sea, but it is still a good point.
I guess that's unless you've got anything more, I'll let you give your pick for the very worst headline that you've come across.
Yes, worst headline of the Roundup, which it's a really bad one. So the headline is Deep Sea Mining Madness, the next unstoppable gold rush boom to devastate our ocean's hidden treasures and unleash unimaginable wealth. It's hard to read.
That's lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a row.
And it's partly hard to read because of the U-turn it takes at the end. Like you have all of these kind of pejorative terms. And then suddenly it's unleashing unimaginable wealth. And your mind has to
it's
shift gears.
Devastating treasures, but also unleashing wealth. It's just a really odd word choice. And honestly, the article wasn't that bad. I mean, it was a big kind of deep sea mining explainer with no particular angle, which I'm not a huge fan of just because I think it's hard to distill what is deep sea mining into one article. But it wasn't a bad article. It was not written in the way that the headline is. So I mean, I will note that writers don't choose their headlines, editors choose the headlines, but I still can't imagine a real human editor going, yes, this is what we're going to title this article.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like they couldn't choose between 3 headlines, so they just mashed them all together.
Yeah. I'm very curious how that happened, but yeah, I like worst headline. I think we can keep doing this, but I don't know if they'll all be quite so bad.
Okay, well then we'll try to wrap it up there. And yeah, like Elyse mentioned, this is something that I guess we're going to try to do. I don't know how often, every month or two, or however often you can put it together, Elyse. And
we'll aim for once a month, but yeah, the deep sea mining news is shifty, so some months might have more than others. We'll see.
And I think we'll keep the editing minimal, and we'll just put this out there. So for everyone listening, thank you. And like, subscribe, share, give us feedback. Yeah. Anything else before we sign off?
No, I think that's it. Yeah, thanks for hosting, Eric. Thanks to everyone for listening. And hopefully we'll do it again soon.
Okay. See you next time.
I threw my arms up and to the side.